if you continually exceed basically what your body's wanting to do, sooner or later the body's going to react in a negative way to that. So it doesn't mean, this is something I get with people saying all the time. They say, well, my HRV or recovery was a little bit low, but I still felt really strong in the gym. Okay, well, it's not saying that you can't do those things. It's just saying that if you do those things, it's going to slow down your recovery processes even further.
What's up, everyone? This is the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. I am your host, Ben Bukolski. I created this podcast because after spending 20 years of my life trying to build as much muscle as humanly possible, I realized there's a lot of other things that are necessities in both building an amazing body with, large muscles, low body fat, and ultimately being healthy that I just wasn't paying attention to. There's so many things that go in that perhaps even more so than training, influence the way you look and the way you feel and the way your mind works. And today's topic is something you guys have been hearing from me a lot lately, and that is heart rate variability, the autonomic nervous system, and energy systems, and how all of these things are dictating the way you look and the way you feel. My guest today is Joel Jamieson, who is the first guy who ever introduced HRV to me way back in 2012 with his system called BioForce HRV. He's now evolved into creating a brand called Morpheus, which is a fully integrated tracking system for HRV and sleep and training and how to look at optimizing recovery. Joel is incredibly brilliant, so much so that a lot of the stuff he says is extremely nonchalant. He comes across and says it like you already know these things. So I highly suggest that you pay attention to his words and not just looking at the words he emphasizes, but looking at those things he seems to kind of gloss over and say without any emphasis, because there's so much gold in this conversation for anyone looking to not only build muscle, but lose fat or perform better or live longer or sleep better or feel better cognitively and perform better cognitively. Like heart rate variability is the determining factor, it seems, in looking at how to optimize all these things, or at least how to measure how all these things interrelate and affect your outcomes. Heart rate variability is an incredibly valuable tool, and Joel is one of the top authorities in the entire world on this topic. So we get into everything you're going to need to know around the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic energy systems, how to use this information to apply directly to your training, and so much more. Joel joins us from Kirkland, Washington, where he lives and thrives and drives helicopters or flies helicopters, which is amazing. So obviously he's enjoying life and trying to keep his HRV low, even though that might keep mine really high, as we talk about a little bit at the end of the podcast here. So I hope you guys enjoy this conversation with Joel Jamieson. And if anyone you know is maybe struggling to build a great body, or maybe they're working really, really hard and feel like they're not getting the results that they deserve, or maybe they're having a hard time losing fat, or maybe they're having a hard time with sleep or stress or inflammation, this is the podcast to share with them, because HRV and ultimately autonomic nervous system is the gateway to improving all these things. So share this episode with at least one person you know who strives to live their greatest life in a body that they love, and enjoy the podcast with Joel Jamieson. Awesome. Joel, what's going on, man? Tell me what's going on in your life, what you're excited about. And we just got a few seconds there to catch up, but I'd love to hear all about what you're currently excited about.
Yeah, I've been working on some technology for the last couple of years called Morpheus. It's a recovery, I call it digital recovery coach. So we're continuing to work on that. I've got a new device that's part of that system that I'm really excited about coming out here in June or so. And then along with that, I've been putting together a conditioning program that automatically adjusts to people, which is something that I think is really kind of the future of training, is how do you truly personalize people's training without them having to be a professional, coach themselves. So working on that.
What type of biometrics is Morpheus looking at? Is it exclusively HRV, or is there other variables as well?
Nope. So Morpheus essentially looks at all the big picture stuff. It looks at how much you walk, or your activity in a day, and calories. It looks at your sleep quality. It looks at HRV. It looks at training, and it looks at subjective markers. How you feel, what soreness levels you report, those kind of things, and essentially aggregates all that data. And the cool thing is, it does it using trackers people already have. So if you have a Fitbit, if you have Apple Watch, whatever devices people are already using, it'll pull in the calories and the activity and the sleep from that. And then our Morpheus band is what you use to actually measure HRV. And it takes all that data and essentially runs some numbers and comes up with a recovery score. And so that's 0 to 100, 0 being dead, and 100% being 100% recovered. And then from that, it gives you 3 heart rate zones for the day. So it gives you essentially a blue zone, which is your recovery zone. So if you want to facilitate recovery, you go hit your blue zone for 30, 40 minutes, and you'll see your recovery score go up. If you want to hit out some conditioning that day, you've got a green zone. You spend most of your time in that green conditioning zone, and over time, that's what's going to build your HRV and build your conditioning. And then there's a red zone, which is essentially kind of your high intensity or max intensity, which, if your recovery is high, you can spend some time in there. If your recovery is low, you want to avoid that. And then the cool thing is, after the workout, it'll then see how much volume intensity you used, and it'll adjust your recovery score accordingly. So if you woke up and you were let's say a 90% recovered, and you go smash yourself, it might drop your recovery score 15, 20 points. If it's a more moderate workout, it might drop it 5 to 10. So it's just a way to gauge the overall impact of that workout, and then again, that'll also be factored into the following day's recovery. So I really wanted to show something or give something that people that would help them put all the pieces together, because people often, as you know well, I'm sure, underestimate the importance of sleep and diet and training and all these things that all go together. There's not one thing, it's everything put together. And so, I started building Morpheus. It was, how do we put all these pieces together in a way that's simplified into just a single recovery score and heart rate zones for people, instead of having to expect them to be able to sort through all these numbers themselves and figure out what it all means. Morpheus does that for them.
Right. How long have you been doing this?
Well, so I came out with my first HRV system in 2012, and that was called BioForce HRV. And we collected about 1.5 million data points from HRV users all over the world. And then I started working at Morpheus about 3 years ago, and it took about 1.5 years to really develop. So we launched that in December of 2018. So it's been on the market a little over a year and 3 months now. And we've been, like I said, just collecting more and more data now. And the cool thing is, the more data we get, the more we can start to analyze. So what we're starting to look at now is, what does somebody with an HRV, which represents higher conditioning, of an 80 to 90 score look like compared to somebody who's got a lower conditioning score, like a 60 to a 70? What does their average sleep look like? How many steps they take per day? How much time they spend in different intensity zones? We can start to profile and see what really is driving people to have higher levels of conditioning and recovery. We can start to really pull out some answers that will help us guide people's training in a more effective way.
What type of athletes do you find benefit most from guiding their training with these heart rate zones? Is it kind of anybody, or is there a very specific demographic you're working with?
Oh, I mean, anybody that needs to develop aerobic fitness, I would say, or conditioning, is going to benefit from having that personalized element to it, because I think heart rate zone training, as it stands today, for the way most people do it, is totally outdated. It's 5 zones. They're static. They're based on some generic 220 minus age bullshit heart rate max formula. They never change. There's just nothing really personalized about them. There's nothing engaging. It's not fun to go in zone 4. What does that mean? So anyone who's doing any sort of heart rate training, I think it's hugely valuable to have them personalized to you on a given day. And it's just a more effective way to approach it. So, anybody that's trying to live longer, anyone that's trying to perform anything, I mean, there's a reason to do some level of conditioning regardless of your goal.
Is Morpheus a real-time system where we have some type of mechanism in front of us, whether on our tracking mechanism or our phone, where we can kind of watch and adjust in real time, or is it just going to give us, a prescription ahead of time on how much time we should spend each zone?
Nope. So basically, it's right now the app is on your phone. So as you're training, it's recording your workout and it's showing you what zone you're in. So if you've gone into like an Orange Theory, you see like a big heart rate zone on the screen that shows you your color zone. What Morpheus gives you, that same concept, but it gives you a blue, green, or a red zone, so you can see real time what zone you're actually in during the workout. And then the new device that we're working on essentially is more of a watch type of deal. So on the watch, you'll see what colored zone you're in and what your heart rate is. So that was kind of the limitation we found so far, is not everybody wants to work out with their phone in front of them, which is understandable.
Totally.
So the new device, like I said, will go more on a wrist arm strap, so people will be able to ditch the phone and go work out and see what colored zone they're in. Then again, afterwards, they would just sync with their phone, upload all the data that way.
Amazing. So I first found you and your stuff back in 2012, maybe even sooner than that, actually. And I think right when you came out with BioForce, and I was most intrigued with all this information you were putting about HRV. And at the time, as a bodybuilder, I knew nothing about what it was, and I knew nothing of the implications. Could you just start giving the audience a bit of an overview? So I've had some people on before to talk about HRV, but I think your explanations are incredible. Obviously, you're probably one of the world experts on HRV and its implications, and I'd love to just kind of start giving the audience an overview, because for anyone who doesn't know what it is, I think it's such a valuable piece of information.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways to look at and describe it, but what it really comes down to, if you want to strip it down to the essentials, is energy. Okay, your body is all about energy, because if your body ever doesn't produce energy, you're going to die within minutes, right? You can't last long without energy. It's why you can't stop breathing, because you can't produce energy without aerobic metabolism. So in order to coordinate all the body systems internally and to make sure that it's directing energy where it needs to go, your body has this thing called the autonomic nervous system. And everybody's familiar with the central nervous system, which is walking and moving around and motor control, not all that sort of stuff. But the autonomic system basically is doing everything behind the scenes. So it's keeping your blood pressure and your heart rate and your oxygen levels. It's keeping all these things where they need to be, and it's also directing where the energy your metabolism produces goes. And really, we can look at two sides. We can look at essentially producing energy for activity and dealing with those sorts of things, and we can look at energy for rebuilding tissues and building bigger, stronger, cells throughout the body. So we basically have what we call the fight or flight system, which is the sympathetic, and that system's turned on. It produces a ton of energy that's designed to basically prepare your body for fight or flight. Okay, so that's a catabolic system. So, bodybuilders love to hear anabolic, catabolic. The sympathetic system is a catabolic system, right? It's breaking down energy in order for your body to be able to go fight or flight. So if I'm going to go do a big workout, or I see someone get hit by a truck, I need to sprint across the road, boom, my sympathetic system kicks on, a whole bunch of energy floods my system, and now I can sprint, or I can lift the weights, or I can do whatever. On the other side of it, we have the parasympathetic nervous system, and that system's job is basically to store energy. It's to rebuild muscle tissue. It's to support the immune system. It's to support hormone production. It's the anabolic side of the equation. Okay, it's what's causing energy to be redirected into building and rebuilding and restoring tissues and cells throughout the body. So what we want to see normally is a good healthy balance between these two systems. And if we're trying to build muscle or trying to improve cardiovascular fitness, obviously we want to be a little bit more anabolic than catabolic, right? We want to be storing and using the energy to repair our tissues more than we want to be breaking them down. So in a nutshell, heart rate variability is evaluating that balance between those two halves of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic system, again, which is catabolic, and the parasympathetic system, which is anabolic. Because what we're measuring with HRV is that parasympathetic nervous system function. We're getting essentially an overall gauge of what our body is doing with its energy. Is it in a catabolic state and breaking down energy because it thinks there's a fight or flight scenario, even though there might not be? Again, it can be mental stress, it can be lack of sleep, it could be nutritional stress. All these things will cause us to go into a catabolic state where energy is being redirected. Or are we in a recovery, rebuilding, anabolic state driven by the parasympathetic system? So HRV just evaluates essentially that balance and can show us over time what our body is doing internally. And obviously, if our goal is to improve our fitness, if we're in a catabolic state much more than we're in an anabolic state, we're going to run into trouble over the long run.
Sure. So what it sounds like you're saying, though, and I want you to clarify this, is that if I'm in a sympathetically dominant state, I'm breaking down energy, and the audience may misconstrue that to mean that it's a fat loss state. So would someone who's looking to lose fat thereby want to be more sympathetically oriented?
I mean, to an extent, yes. Okay, if you're talking about losing fat, why do we take sympathetic stimulants, right? Stimulants are a massive sympathetic driver, right? We take pre-workout stimulants, we take ephedrine and caffeine. All these things are doing is activating the sympathetic nervous system because we're breaking down, we're breaking down energy. So yes, if you're trying to lose fat, you do want to have a little bit more sympathetic activation. The problem is if you go too far that direction, okay, that's where you run into bigger caloric deficits than necessary. That's where you're going to start getting injured. You're going to start getting overtrained. Your body's going to start trying to decrease its sympathetic function because you're bombarding it chronically with sympathetic stimulants, that sort of thing. So yes, if your goal is to lose fat, you do actually want a little bit more sympathetic activity than somebody who's trying to, gain muscle or someone who's trying to gain performance. Again, it's always just, what's appropriate for the individual. And again, you don't want to go so far in that sympathetic realm. You've all seen that, if you're living on caffeine, ephedrine, and aspirin, the old school stack, and you're not sleeping, more than 5 hours a night, yeah, you might lose some fat, but you're going to start losing muscle tissue. You're going to start losing other things as well.
Interesting. Now, tying this together with the other stuff you're talking about, so you mentioned to me that you had put together a certification system for over 4,000 coaches on energy systems. And I'd love to start bridging the gap between how HRV is impacting energy systems and how energy systems are impacting how we're training. So do you see a nice line there to start tying how HRV into how the HRV systems the autonomic nervous system is impacting energy systems?
Sure. So there's a really interesting correlation between HRV, essentially your average HRV score, and your VO2 max, which is kind of the generic, big picture of aerobic fitness and conditioning. So people with higher HRV are inherently going to have higher levels of aerobic fitness, and there's just a very strong relationship between the two, simply because, again, if that parasympathetic system is our rest and digest and recover and repair system, more and more training that develops, the aerobic system is going to support greater levels of HRV. In other words, we become better at recovering from everything. It's not just training. We become better at recovering from life itself and all the stresses of life. So we're able to cope with, less sleep and mental stress better if we have higher levels of aerobic fitness and thus greater parasympathetic or greater levels of HRV. And there's actually a lot of studies looking at life expectancy and HRV. It also correlates. So if people have HRV in the 80s and 90s, they have a greater life expectancy than people who have HRV in the 50s and 60s. Essentially, what it's showing us is that the aerobic energy system is hugely important for a lot of things. It's important for recovery. It's important for age and disease prevention. It's important for just well-being and fitness. It's important for a lot of different things across a lot of different areas of fitness. And HRV is the single best gauge we have of seeing where that is actually at in changing on a daily basis.
Super interesting. Now, I know a lot of our demographic is, muscle building centric, but really they're not. They're just like longevity centric and health centric, and muscle building is a part of it, but they just ultimately want to be healthy and lean. How does Morpheus start to dictate a volume of aerobic training? Can you start to just kind of lay that out? Like, it sounds like having better aerobic fitness is just better, but is that the case?
I mean, to an extent, right? I mean, you don't need, the marathon runner's aerobic engine.
At what point does it become a negative thing, I guess?
It becomes a negative if it's taken away from, let's say you do want to build muscle, you do want to have a certain type of physique. If you're doing so much aerobic development work, of course, it's going to compromise how much muscle you can build, and your body will start to become specialized more for endurance and less for strength and power. So it's always about finding the right balance. But I would say, your average person who just wants to be in good shape, they don't want to get cardiovascular disease or die of a stroke or all these things that impact so many people. An HRV using Morpheus or using a lot of systems, in the 80s is about where you want to be, low to mid 80s. And again, every HRV system is different, so you can't apply that universally. But we've looked at lots and lots of data. In that 80 to 85 range is a good enough range for disease prevention and overall health and supports recovery. And there's really no need to go extremely beyond that. And it's the same thing resting heart rate. So resting heart rate will correlate inversely with HRV. So higher HRV is generally lower resting heart rate. Same thing, I would say most people, in the 30 to 50-year-old range, a good level of health is going to be a resting heart rate somewhere between 50 and 56, 57, 58, somewhere in that range. And the low to mid 50s is going to correlate roughly to the HRV in the low 80s as far as Morpheus is concerned. So generally speaking, I mean, don't get me wrong, you can increase aerobic fitness well beyond that, but for the average person, it's probably a point of diminishing returns where it's going to take a whole lot more work to marginally increase aerobic fitness, in which case you're really not getting that much more benefit anyway. And again, you can probably start to compromise, building muscle and having, a physique that most people want. So.
Awesome. Can you start to guide us down the path of how our listeners can use HRV to determine and decipher from how they should be training to kind of drive their training decisions?
Yeah, so in the grand scheme of things, you want to use HRV for two, big purposes. Number one is, what does my average HRV look like? Again, like I just mentioned, it's a marker of a general aerobic fitness. It's a marker of how well your body can cope with stress, how well it can recover from training, all those sorts of things. So you want to look at your baseline number as a gauge of, what kind of shape am I really in? Like I just mentioned, if your HRV is low, then you're going to want to spend more time doing aerobic development work and conditioning to get it up again where I just mentioned, so that you can again have better recovery, be less likely to get disease and all those sorts of things. So that's the big picture, is like use it to track your fitness levels, because that's one thing. You can track strength easily. I mean, can I lift the weight or can't I lift the weight? I can track muscle size. I can measure things. I can check body fat. But most people don't really understand how to measure conditioning or how to measure aerobic fitness. No one's going to go do the Cooper's test and all these things on a regular basis. But HRV allows you to see, what does my conditioning level look like? And that's something I've used with athletes for many years. Combat athletes have to get in great shape for a fight. So we've used HRV to see where they're at in their training camp versus where they need to be to make sure, their fitness and their conditioning is where it needs to be before their fight. So you can use it, again, it's just a baseline measurement tool. And then the second way to use it, again, is to just adjust your programming on a daily basis to prevent yourself from going, again, too far that direction towards that sympathetic dominance, because that's where you lead to problems. So you basically it depends on the system. Okay, every HRV system is different. I don't want to tell everyone they have to buy Morpheus. There are other HRV systems out there. And they all work a little bit differently, but what you're looking for is essentially large swings outside of your normal range. And that's what most of these systems these days are doing, is evaluating what's this person's normal range and where are they at each day. And then from that, you're essentially able to see, like, is my body in a really, catabolic state? Is it really sympathetic? Is it really dealing with a lot of mental stress or physical stress or whatever stress? Or is it more in a rest, recovery, digest, relaxation, anabolic state, and making sure that balance is where it needs to be? So, on any given day, if you take your HRV and you see that it's, fairly outside the norm, and again, each system will identify that a little bit differently, then you just want to be aware of it and you want to make your training decisions accordingly. What I would typically say is, if someone's HRV is below, 80% or so on Morpheus, other systems, again, are going to do it differently, then I would want to avoid too much max effort lifting. So I'd want to avoid squatting or lifting or anything like that above 90% of their max. I typically would want to avoid, heart rates above 90% of their max, because those are really the places where the most stress, is put on the body. Is when you're really going above 90%, in the upper 80s, 90%, that places a ton of stress in the body. And if we can see from HRV, the body's already under a lot of stress, there's not really a benefit to just smashing it with even more. So you just can use it for, little daily adjustments like that. So let's say I have, a heavy squat day and might wake up, my HRV shows me like I'm not really very well recovered. I might be able to either lower the volume a bit, or I might say, okay, today I'm going to go in and do something else, and then tomorrow I'm going to come in and do my heavy squat day, or whatever the case may be.
Just to clarify, when you say heavy, are we talking like percent max or just total volume? So, because I think those could be very different, right?
Yeah, I want to avoid in general above 90%. So above 90% is where your fastest twitch muscle fibers are going to come into play. It's what requires the most CNS activity. It's what basically places, an exponentially greater amount of stress in the body than an 80%. And it's not linear, right? 80% of 1 rep max is not linear up to 100. And once you hit 90 and above, that amount of stress,
exponentially greater.
Exponentially greater. So I would want to basically avoid that above 90% range. And I'd also want to just, keep the volume in check. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean, if my HRV shows me I'm fatigued, it doesn't mean like don't go train at all. It just means today's probably not the day to go out and crank out a bunch of max effort reps and go super heavy and go to failure and really crush myself. I mean, today's probably a day to take a more moderate approach and allow my body to recover so I can get back after it the following day. The problem is this is, if you continually exceed basically what your body's wanting to do, sooner or later the body's going to react in a negative way to that. So it doesn't mean, this is something I get with people saying all the time. They say, well, my HRV or recovery was a little bit low, but I still felt really strong in the gym. Okay, well, It's not saying that you can't do those things. It's just saying that if you do those things, it's going to slow down your recovery processes even further. So really what we think of HRV is a prediction or a gauge of how quickly are you going to recover from this workout.
Right.
So let's say my recovery is 95% and I go do a given workout. I'm probably going to recover a lot faster if I started with a 95% recovery than if I started with a 75% recovery. So it's predicting, or it's a gauge of how much stress your body can recover from. And if you consistently exceed that, you're going to run into problems. There's no way around it.
You train some really high-level athletes. Can you tell us how you use HRV to determine or maybe predict nutrition?
Sure. I mean, the biggest thing is especially I'll talk about combat athletes since that's who I've worked with the most, is these guys are training really high volumes. A lot of them are training 8, 10, 12, sometimes even more sessions per week. So at the same time, a lot of them are trying to drop weight, right? Which is a very, very stressful thing. Like, let's train you 14, 15 hours a week and try and drop fat in the same point in time. It's very tricky. So what we try to do, yeah, exactly. So you want to make sure that nutrition is not too deficient, because again, if you have too much of a caloric restriction, you start training too much on low carbs and all these sorts of things, you're going to see these big sympathetic changes basically in HRV. You're going to see their HRV start to plummet through the ground. So again, we're using it to make sure they're not spending so much time in that sympathetic side of things. Again, you want to have a little bit more than normal because you are trying to lose weight, but we want to make sure they're not spending so much time in that side of things that they're going to, pull a hamstring, or they're going to have some sort of injury, or they're just going to, perform poorly and be sluggish. So biggest thing I said is just making sure that they are going to have to be in a caloric deficit, obviously, but making sure that it's a moderate enough caloric deficit that it's not going so far down that path of overreaching, because their calories just are so far off of their, expenditure.
Right. So one of your athletes wakes up today, sees a let's say a low level of HRV. Are you making nutritional adjustments on the fly, or are you making training adjustments first?
We'll kind of look at their diet first and see if it's a problem, right? I mean, make sure that they're actually doing what the things they're supposed to be doing. Start by making the training adjustments, and then if you see things again, it's one thing if it's one time, maybe one night they didn't sleep, or one night they, were just stressed out or whatever. If it's one time, that's different than if it's all the time. If you're starting to see patterns, then you're going to dig a lot deeper into nutritional, and you're going to dig a lot deeper into other things as well. So, you're always looking at, again, what is this person doing, and if you're seeing chronic issues, then it's either training, nutrition, sleep, mental, it's all those things put together, and you start diving in there. But I wouldn't say like each and every day we're trying to just micro adjust calories. We're just looking at the big picture of things and making sure the trends are headed in the right direction.
Awesome. Have you ever trained any athletes who are on a ketogenic diet, and look? I'm curious how that will affect HRV and recovery.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you really see with HRV is just this individuality of things. Some athletes look pretty good on ketogenic diet, and they seem to recover just fine, and their numbers look solid. And then some people, as soon as they stop taking the carbs in and they go into ketogenic state, they look worse. Like there's not really a guarantee. I would say some people, again, do really well on low carb or ketogenic. Some people don't, and I think it kind of depends on their own biochemistry, their training history. Who knows what all the variables are that drive that? But I've seen varied responses. I've seen great results with some people, and I've seen less than great results in other people.
Interesting. Now, when you're preparing a MMA athlete or a combat sport athlete for a fight or meet or whatever it may be, and you start them a fair degree of time out, whether it be 8 weeks out or 10 weeks out or 12 weeks out, whatever it is, what are kind of your first lines of intervention with whether that be their nutrition or the training or the supplementation, as far as starting to move the needle? Just curious about your thought process. Is it like, you're going to drop the hammer on the training and the nutrition, or which lever are you pulling first?
Generally speaking, the training lever. So I don't know if you're familiar with this research. A number of years ago, they did this research where they essentially tracked people in different, basically in different continents, and they tracked their activity levels using a Fitbit, and then they used what's called the doubly labeled water technique, where they measure essentially metabolism. So we had this inherent idea that if we move 20,000 steps, that we're going to burn twice as many calories as if we walk 10,000 steps, right? Which would, again, we would think would be twice as much if we go 5,000 steps. That's actually not true. They essentially found that your body is only capable of producing a certain amount of calories in a given day. I mean, your metabolism is limited. It can't produce endless amounts of calories. It can't produce 10,000 calories of energy. You just can't physically do it. There's a limit. It's like there's only so many hours you can work in a day. Well, there's only so many calories your body can break down in a given period of time. So if you go 30,000 steps, you're not burning 3 times more calories. And if you go 10,000 steps, what you're actually doing is redirecting calories from, immune system function and hormonal production and tissue rebuilding, remodeling of strength and power areas into this activity. So there's this whole concept. It's called the energy constrained, model of metabolism or theory of metabolism. And basically, it just says, look, your metabolism is limited. There's only so many places your body can produce or can deliver energy to, or only so much it can do in a given point in time. No matter how many calories you eat, doesn't matter. I can't eat 10,000 calories a day. Well, therefore I can go 30,000 steps. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
Same thing. Your body can only break down so much food at a given time or over a given time. So the first thing we're going to look at is just managing training and making those training adjustments, because that's where the energy expenditure side is coming from. And we've got to manage that appropriately. If we push their training too high, too fast, or we try to have them expend way more calories than they should, then it's obviously going to pull away from recovery. It's going to pull away from their ability to adapt to that. So I always start with the training, again, because the energy side is limited. So I want to make sure that we're expending the energy as intelligently as possible and making those adjustments. And then over time, we'll make the dietary adjustments to, accommodate and adjust to that. And again, making sure that we're not creating this huge disparity in terms of their caloric needs versus what they're actually out there doing.
And that's brilliant and so useful. What are some of your top parasympathetic interventions? Like if someone's obviously sympathetically driven and maybe overtrained, what are your first lines of intervening?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things. Number one, you want to try to limit stimulants, honestly, because this day and age, people live on pre-workout stimulants and then they live on coffee and everything in between. So if you are constantly ingesting stimulants, you're essentially pushing your body into that state. So the first thing is limit their stimulants and try to, avoid these external things. Number two, we just go through what I call like a rebound workout, which is essentially a little bit of mobility, some breathing exercises to facilitate blood flow, a little bit of low intensity or moderate intensity cardio, a little bit of light lifting to, again, pump blood into different muscle groups, and then just trying to get them to rest and relax when they're not training. So it's making sure they can shut that switch off when they leave the gym. So, again, the first thing is always going to be just get them in a parasympathetic state, and that's rest, relax, regenerate, rebound, use rebound workouts. And then if those things still aren't working, then you can start looking at interventions like swimming and cold plunges and sauna and cryotherapy and all these additional things that people are now turning to first. They're looking at like, let's go cryotherapy every single day. Well, that's not a great approach.
Do we know that's a parasympathetic input, or is that like it's acute sympathetic that gives us a parasympathetic response? Or
exactly, that's what most of these regeneration type things are. They're acute sympathetic drivers that cause a big parasympathetic rebound, right? So it's essentially the devil's in the dose, right? If I have a little bit of sympathetic stimulus, then I can get the body to switch into that recovery mode afterwards and hopefully have a little bit of a longer impact, a longer parasympathetic state than I had sympathetic state. If you overdo these things, then they're actually going to cause the opposite effect. So if I was to cryotherapy for, 5 times a day, or I was to go spend an hour in an ice bath or whatever, it would cause a much greater sympathetic response than I want. And it would actually take away from recovery. So I tend to actually avoid the use of those things unless it becomes really necessary. You want to stick with, again, getting people to just mentally relax, going through meditation every day, making sure their nutrition's on point and their calories aren't too low, making sure they're getting enough sleep, making sure they're going through breathing, mobility, and doing all these things to facilitate recovery at the end of a workout. So that's actually one thing people don't do nearly enough of is a cool down. People nowadays will go through these ridiculously elaborate warm-ups, and then they'll just finish their last set and walk out of the gym. So
and go shove a cheeseburger down their gullet.
Yeah, exactly. So what I actually have people really focus on is a 5 to 10 minute cool down process where the goal is get your heart rate as close to your resting heart rate, or at least as close to it was when you walked in the gym when you leave. So if you can do that, you're basically shutting off that sympathetic system quicker, and you're activating that recovery parasympathetic system as you're leaving the gym versus, going out and having a Red Bull and, like I said, pounding a cheeseburger and staying in that sympathetic state for an extra hour or two. You've just sabotaged, the first couple hours of recovery, which are really a big driver of things. So, I think it's really important for people to cool down properly and make sure that they're doing everything they can to shut that sympathetic system off and get that parasympathetic system working as soon as you leave the gym.
Man, that's brilliant. You're one of the only other people I've heard say that. Like, that's my first line of intervention for every one of my clients. Is like, if you can't sit on your ass for 5 minutes and put your phone away, don't bother putting in a post-workout shake. Don't even bother putting in a post-workout meal until you do that. Because, I mean, at some point, your body will obviously come down from that elevated sympathetic state. But, you know, the faster you can do it, like you say, the faster you can kind of get your body back into digestive mode and get your stomach emptying and get those calories that you need to start recovery back in.
Yep, it makes a huge difference. And I'll say that the one thing, so this is, people always talk about performance enhancing drugs, and I've seen people on them, and I've seen their HRV. And you know what it does? It makes you massively parasympathetic. I mean, literally, absolutely. That's
like anabolic steroids or which,
yes, absolutely. You'll see someone's HRV jump 5-10 points as soon as their blood levels of tests start to go up or whatever they're taking, simply because think about it. What do anabolic steroids do? They increase protein synthesis and anabolic. The more anabolic, that inherently means you're more parasympathetic. So you will see people who are on drugs, you will see their HRV system skyrocket, and they will stay there. You won't see these drops after their workouts because their body just, boom, instantly shuts off sympathetic and goes into this parasympathetic state, because that's essentially what the drugs are doing, is facilitating parasympathetic function and recovery.
I had no idea. Now, a couple of things you said in there, like you say a lot of things very nonchalantly in passing, and I don't want to just gloss over them. So you mentioned meditation, you mentioned breathing, and do you have any practices that you advocate, or is it just like, hey, go and like practice sitting down and being mindful, or do you have any very particular practices that you tell people to partake in?
Yeah, so breathing is a complex topic. We get into breathing. You could take hours to look at different breathing technique. There's, I would just kind of say for your readers that want to learn more about breathing stuff, there's a guy named Bill Hartman, who's a PT out of Indianapolis, who's a good friend of mine.
Yep.
He's got a book called All Gain, No Pain.
Okay.
And in that book, he goes through a lot of different breathing exercises. And basically, breathing is a pattern, just like squatting, just like benching, just like any lift. Your body develops these breathing habits, these breathing patterns, and some can be much more efficient or much more inefficient depending on how your body is built and how you've learned to breathe, which again, most people just do reflexively. So Bill gives you a whole bunch of different types of exercises that can improve your essentially breathing efficiency, for lack of a better term, and being able to have a full breath, basically be able to breathe all the way in and all the way out, and having a good respiratory function drives parasympathetic nervous system activity. So a lot of it is just learning how to breathe with these different patterns. And again, they can't really describe them or get into details.
You don't do like counts or anything like that. It's just about mechanics.
It's about mechanics and position, honestly. So there's a whole assessment you can do with essentially your infrasternal angle, which is the angle at the bottom of your ribs, to kind of evaluate what your breathing patterns look like. And then Bill gives you some different exercises and drills to go through. So number one is just actively using these sorts of breathing exercises to make yourself more efficient at breathing. And then number two is literally just spending time to relax. And that's just the meditation side of things. And different people do it differently. Some people want to listen to music. Some people want to be in a room with total silence. Some people want to be in a dark room. Some people want to have lights. It doesn't really matter. Whatever the person finds relaxing, even just spending 5 minutes a day, I've seen make huge differences or huge improvements in people's recovery, because they're just so used to being in a sympathetic state, they never shut it off. And even just getting them to do that for 5 or 10 minutes breaks that cycle. It's just this big switch that gets turned on, and all of a sudden their recovery goes up because they've shut that sympathetic system off. So there's lots of different apps out there. I mean, what's the one that blanking on the name of? There's a ton of
Headspace meditation. Or something.
Yeah, Headspace. Thank you. That's what I was thinking of. Headspace is out there. That one's a good one. I've used that. So whatever people need to do to find that happy place and just relax for a minute is an important thing to do for 5 or 10 minutes a day. Like I said, it doesn't have to be an hour. It doesn't have to be chanting. And just getting yourself into that recovery state is really important for shutting that sympathetic system off, again, even for a short period of time. So I just look at both of those sides of things. It's number one, teaching them to breathe more effectively through a concerted breathing pattern and breathing exercises. And then number two, just finding time throughout the day to relax. If you can do those two things, I guarantee you'll see people's recovery improve dramatically.
How much do you manipulate intra-workout variables with respect to nutrition? So if you know someone of your athletes is in kind of a calorically depleted state, or they're maybe not getting the carbohydrates they need to recover, or maybe even their HRV is high, like what percent do you have, like maybe a percentage you start knocking down volume? Or so would you knock down volume of work first, or just take them completely out of that energy system and put them more into like their green conditioning zone?
I mean, depends on the situation, right? If someone's got a fight coming up, they're going to have to do a certain volume of work. There's no way around that. So we're just going to manage that again by, making sure the intensity is not too high, making sure their post-workout stuff is still in recovery, making sure their nutrient timing is all there. So, it's always just about putting all these pieces together. I would say the biggest thing I try to avoid is a lot of high intensity training on a depleted carbohydrate state. Because basically, if you look at the research, if you do a lot of high intensity training, you deplete glycogen stores. What that does is cause a ton of inflammation. And that inflammation takes a lot longer to shut off if you're, again, in a sympathetic state. So actually, that's one more thing I should mention about HRV that's really fascinating is there's a whole new field these days or in the last few years called neuroimmunology. And essentially what that does is looks at the connection between the nervous system and the immune system, right? And so what they find basically is that the sympathetic system drives inflammation. Okay, now this makes sense if you think about it, because what is the sympathetic nervous system for, right? It's for fight or flight. Mm-hmm. So in the biological sense, if you're out in the wild and you literally do encounter a fight or flight scenario, you want that immune system on high alert, mm-hmm. right? The immune system's job is to protect you from foreign invaders and to repair tissues that are damaged, right? So the people always think inflammation is bad. The inflammation is not bad. Inflammation is what starts the repair process. So if we are sympathetic, we are in an inherently pro-inflammatory state, okay? We have inflammation being produced and supported through production of what are called cytokines, which are little inflammatory markers. Mm-hmm. Now, the other side is the parasympathetic system. And what do you think the parasympathetic's job is? It's to turn off inflammation, okay? Its job is essentially to shut that process of inflammation down because it's going through the repair process. It doesn't need to have that signal anymore. It's actually starting the rebuilding, the repair process. So again, HRV is kind of this overall gauge of inflammatory processes. When we see HRV really low, it tells us the body is under a lot of sympathetic stress and we're seeing a lot of inflammation. And over time, if the brain sees all this inflammation happening, that's where it starts to make changes that we would perceive as overtraining and perceive as things that are negative. Appetite, weight loss, all those sorts of things that would be, through muscle loss would be bad. So essentially what this comes down to is, if someone is going to be in a depleted caloric state, that's fine. But what we want to not do is have them do a lot of training in a glycogen depleted state, because that's just going to exacerbate that inflammatory response. So a lot of the training, adjustments and things you're making are, again, nutrient timing based. So if they're going to spar, they're going to lift, I don't want them doing that in this depleted carbohydrate state. So carbohydrates before, protein after, right, is a more important way to look at it. If someone's trying to drop some weight, but still make sure they can get their volume of training that need into the workout.
That was the next question I wanted to dig into, because we got a lot of people talking about if it fits your macros and it doesn't matter what time you take in nutrients. So this is the argument against that stuff, right? Is people say, oh, it doesn't matter if you eat one meal or six or like. So talk to us about that. Like, I mean, you said that you said it. Kind of answered the question already, but if I know my sympathetic arousal is high, or I know maybe my body's in a stress state, taking those carbohydrates in before a workout to ensure that I'm bringing myself down to that state before I go in and train and make sure I get protein right after. Is that kind of the biggest
absolutely.
Takeaway?
It is. It's essentially the more you train the glycogen depleted state, the more inflammation you're going to produce. The slower you're essentially going to recover, because it's going to take more time to turn that inflammation off, and you're also not going to perform as well. So the biggest thing, like I said, if people are in a caloric deficit and they're trying to lose some fat, it does matter where the timing of things happen, because training in a state where you have no carbs before the workout and then you just smash thousands of grams after the workout is a different response than the exact opposite. So the training response is going to be dictated by what your nutritional state was when you trained, more than people realize. It's not just what you shove in your body afterwards. It's what was the state when you trained, because that's where all the signaling happens, right? The signaling happens inside the body as a result of the state of the body when you are training. So if you were in a very glycogen depleted, calorically depleted state, that's going to have a whole different cascade of signals than if you were in a more normalized state, you had enough carbohydrates to train with. So the body basically, if you want to put it in the simplest terms, the body does not like being in a glycogen depleted state. It's a very stressful thing on the body, because it tells the body, like, hey, there's something wrong here. There's lots of exertion going on. I don't want to be in a glycogen depleted state. So it's a big alarm that gets set off as you start to deplete glycogen levels down to very low levels. And if you train, 30, 60 minutes at fairly high intensities on low carbs, you're going to get there fairly quickly.
How do you
especially
feel
if you do that over and over again?
Yeah. How do you feel about fasted training?
Again,
Same,
lower
same idea.
lower intensities I think are fine. So the whole bodybuilder approach of using low intensity steady state stuff in the mornings with fasted, I think if you're trying to burn some fat, that's fine. You're not going to chronically deplete glycogen at 4 miles an hour on an incline treadmill. That's not going to happen because you're not going to tap into those glycogen stores. You're going to be burning more fat. So what I would say is just if you're training in a fasted state, it needs to be a more low, moderate intensity. If you start getting up into the higher intensities where you're depleting glycogen, that's something I would try to avoid.
What's the biggest mistake you see people making when it comes to burning fat?
It's basically have too big of a caloric deficit. They switch on both ends, so they'll cut calories back quickly, and then they'll also ramp up their training dramatically at the same time. So you're essentially, like I told you, the body is limited in its energy production. So if you're all of a sudden doubling your energy input or expenditure for the day and you're cutting your calories in half, it's a way too big of a deficit. And these huge deficits, again, they trigger things in the body. They trigger you to be way hungrier than you think should be. And then you binge sometimes, or they're going to train you to not want to go to the gym on day 5 because your body's just so depleted. There's actually a great paper I can find for you where they looked at basically 3 groups of people. And in group 1, they did, I can't remember how they categorized it. It was like 4 kilowatts of kilowatts of exercise a week. One did 8, and then one did 12. So they looked at basically, they kept the calories, the deficit relatively the same for these 3 groups. And you would inherently think, people would think like, hey, well, the exercise group that did 12 kilowatts must have lost more fat than the one that did 8, right? Well, that's actually not what happened. So there was a more fat loss in the middle group than there was in the first group. So from 4 kilowatts to 8 kilowatts, there was greater fat loss. In other words, they worked out twice as much. They did lose more fat. But interestingly enough, the group that worked out the most, the 12, only lost as much fat as the very first group. So they lost less fat than the second group and literally was identical to the first group. So in other words, they tripled the amount of activity they did, but they didn't actually lose any more. I don't think it was body fat. I think they just measured weight. They didn't lose any more weight than the group that did the lowest amount of exercise, and the group that did the moderate lost the most. So again, it's this faulty thinking to be like, okay, I'm going to burn more fat. Well, how do I do that? Well, I'm just going to cut my calories in half, and then I'm going to go train twice as much. It's just creating way too big of a deficit. The body does not like that. So I think most people are much better off with more of like a 300 to 500 calorie deficit will work a lot longer in the long run than trying to do a 1,500 calorie or 2,000 calorie deficit, without realizing they're in that big a deficit. That's, I think, the biggest mistake people make is too much too fast and expecting it to happen overnight.
Do you like any particular ratios of macronutrients for improvement in body composition?
That's a tough one. I don't know that there's a universal. I've seen people do fine on higher carbs, and I've seen some people do much better on a little bit lower carbs. I would say in general, I like to keep the protein a pound per or 1 gram per pound of body weight. I think it's a pretty universal and simple rule to apply. And then carbohydrates would kind of be activity dependent, honestly. If you're going to go do a lot of high intensity training, then I would keep the carbohydrates a little bit higher. And the fat a little bit lower. And if you're going to do a little bit less training, I would, have the inverse of that. So the biggest thing is, just making sure that that big picture of total calories is there. I don't think there's a massive difference between 40% carbs and 50% carbs or 60% carbs, as long as the overall calories are there and the nutrient quality is there. And the timing is there. I think that's the most important thing.
Perfect, man. And you're saying so many things in passing that I want to acknowledge is like, you're saying the quality of the nutrients rather than just the quantity matters. Just because sometimes to you, it's just it's obvious, but some of our listeners, if you don't acknowledge, they won't, their brain won't kind of take it in. Is there any carbohydrate or protein sources that you tend to lean toward more? Like, are you a fructose guy? Are you, a rice guy? Or are you wild meat? Does it matter? Like any particular, or fat sources even, any particular foods that you tend to migrate toward more for performance?
I know it's kind of a cliche, but I actually think kind of a variety is a good thing. But a variety within the person individual, responses. So again, diet is one of those things I can tell you just from looking at HRV data. One person can eat rice and look great. Another person has a response to it, and you see it tank their HRV. So it's hard to give generic, everybody should go eat these things type of recommendations, just because I've seen so much varied responses. But I would say, a variety in terms of fruits and vegetables for just health is important. And I'm not saying go gorge yourself on fruit if you're trying to lose weight, but just getting a good variety of quality nutrients from fruits and vegetables is important for, health and making sure you're not deficient in things. other than that, I think lean meats, I don't care if it's chicken, fish, salmon. Again, I think a variety of protein sources is better than getting all your protein from a single source. And same thing with fats, really. It's more about a variety of these different things that your body responds well to than trying to say eat these exact same things every single day. I think it's better to have, again, just more variety in your diet than that.
How much are you attempting to impact or influence an athlete's psychological state or mindset or motivation like that? Like as a nutritional coach, are you giving them any strategies or taking part in any way in their psychological well-being and mindset?
It depends on the athlete. Some athletes need a lot more help than others, I would say, on that end of things. I worked with a guy named Brian Kane, who's what I would call a mental performance type of guy. So if there's somebody who I really think needs that end, like that's not my specialty, so I'll refer to Brian or to somebody else.
Correct.
If it's just kind of your average guy who needs some help, I'll certainly try some different things in terms of just a lot of it's mindset driven, a lot of it's habit driven, a lot of those sorts of things, and making sure they understand why they're doing the things they're doing, that they're accountable for the things they're doing. They record. Actually, the simplest thing people can do, honestly, it's mind-bogglingly simple. Just recording what you eat and recording your training literally makes a difference. There's research on this showing it makes a difference in how likely you are to stick to these things that you're doing and whether or not you're actually following them. So there's a lot of really simple things like that. Like, again, just making sure people are tracking them, making sure they're accountable to things that I'll start with. And again, if someone's got a more, I'm in the fight business, people are head cases in general. Some of those
stress,
things,
man. Someone's trying to kill you, right?
Exactly. I mean, there's maybe something wrong with you because you want to be in that profession in the first place. I don't know. But some people you can certainly just kind of come up with some strategies that make a big difference. And some people you want to send to somebody who's, got more experience in that end, and that's their whole job. Very
cool, man. How do you eat on a day-to-day basis? You eat any particular style or just kind of whatever you feel like eating that day?
Yeah, so I actually like varying my carbs a bit. So I do a little bit of intermittent fasting, and then when I'm doing that, I'll keep my intensity, my cardio really low. So I'll usually ride bike, just go for a bike ride, or keep my intensity fairly low. And then I'll usually do 4 days of lower carb and 3 days of higher carb. So I tend to cycle my nutrients like that quite a bit. I tend to respond better. If I'm trying to lose fat, then I'll essentially kind of have 4 caloric deficit days and 3 maintenance days. If I'm trying to do the opposite, I'll kind of have 4 to 5 caloric surpluses and a couple days of maintenance or even a slight deficit. So I tend to rotate things quite a bit. And again, that's in concert with my lifting. So I eat more of my carbs on my lifting days, which are typically Monday, Wednesday, Friday, more heavy lifting. Then I'll eat lower carbs on my lower intensity cardio days. So it changes depending on the day, but I just personally like to cycle things up.
Do you have any interventions to improve sleep for whether it be yourself or your athletes?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. The first one kind of goes back to what we talked about with sympathetic stimulants, right? Mm-hmm. So people are drinking coffee at 8, 9 o'clock at night, wondering why they can't sleep at 11. So
I have no idea.
Number one is just looking at that is making sure their stimulants are cut out in a timely fashion throughout the day. I would say number 2 is actually making sure their sleeping environment what it needs to be. What boggles my mind is people spend how much money on their cars and their houses, and then they'll get some like $800 mattress that's just dirt cheap. I mean, people should invest.
Put an 80-inch TV in their bedroom.
Yeah, exactly. So it's looking at the environment. What is their when's the last time you bought a new mattress? How comfortable is it? There's a mattress company called Helix, which I really like. You can basically personalize your bed. So you can put in a bunch of stuff about your weight and how firm or how soft and all these different things, how plush, and they'll basically custom make you a mattress and ship it out to you. If you don't like it, you can send it back, which is really cool. So I like that aspect a lot. But I think looking at the mattress, again, make sure there's no TV, looking at how dark it is, looking at noise, just really trying to optimize that sleeping environment is the second thing. And then number 3 is if you've taught them how to turn off that sympathetic system through, again, breathing exercises, through meditation, through all those sorts of things, and they need to be doing those sort of things as they get ready for bed. That basically it's a skill. Okay,
totally.
Learning how to shut that system off is a skill, and once you learn that skill, then you can use it to shut off after a workout. You can use it to get yourself ready for bed. You can do it for all those sorts of things. And I would say 4. It's actually about consistency of when you go to sleep. What people have a hard time with is if their sleep schedule is hugely varied, then their sleep's going to be a lot less quality, or they're going to have a lot more problems with it than if they try to go to bed at basically the same time every single night. And they've actually shown that quite a bit. People who sleep, totally different hours in the weekend versus the week tend to have more problems, essentially, the people that go to bed consistently, even on the weekends, which sucks.
For sure. Yeah.
But just trying to be, I would just say, you don't have to be perfect, but just trying to make your sleep schedule and habits as consistent as possible makes a big difference as well.
Right. The thing that's moved the needle for me most on sleep, man, is when most people can't sleep, they usually try to do something, right? They either get up and try to watch TV or play on their phone or something, or even if it's read. All those usually require putting a light on. For me, it's like just taking that time. And for the first little while, it sucks where maybe you're meditating, you're breathing, or doing something internal like calming your mind, or doing a gratitude practice, or some type of mindfulness practice. And the first couple of weeks, it's challenging, but eventually it becomes a superpower where I can literally count backwards from 10 and fall back asleep, or count back from 10 and fall asleep to begin with. So creating that internal control over your ability to fall back asleep has really been a kind of a superpower for me lately, man. Because I used to, like many people, like many bodybuilders especially, have a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep. And you get up and you end up like checking your phone or watch TV or whatever the hell you're trying to do, and they think that's putting them back to sleep because ultimately it tires them out. But the sleep pressure builds up. But ultimately, as soon as you learn to kind of take that internal control over your ability to fall asleep, my sleep has been dramatically improved. And anytime I wake up, it's just a matter of seconds before I fall back asleep, which has been a huge difference maker for me. Do you pay attention to light at all? Like cutting down people's light before bed, or
Yes.
Yeah, phones?
Light makes a huge difference. I would say lighting your phones, lighting your TV, all that stuff absolutely makes a big difference. I've got a cabin up in the mountains, and I've got this room downstairs I sleep in. It's like a cave. There's no windows in it, and it's when you shut the door.
Sound like you have my life, man. I'm moving to Kirkland, I think.
Yeah, there you go. So anyway, the weird thing is when I'm at home, I usually wake up maybe once a night to go to the bathroom, and I can have this weird innate sense of what time it is, and I'll usually just try and guess what time it is, and I can see in my bathroom what time it is, and for some reason I'm just usually pretty close. But when I go to the cabin, it's dark in that room. I can have no sense. Like I'll wake up and have no idea what time it is, and you just have a much deeper level of sleep if you're in a completely dark environment. So whatever people can do, adding blackout blinds, or making sure their doors are closed and their lights are off and their phones are turned off and TV, all those sorts of, any sort of thing you can do to minimize light when you're sleeping seems to have a really big impact on the depth and the quality of the sleep that you get.
Very cool. Any special supplements that you like to use, whether it be for cognitive performance or anything at all?
I mean, that's a big range. It really depends on the topic or the goal. But in general, I like the cognitive supplementation. Honestly, I've played around with probably every nootropic known to man, from the racetams to different choline sources to hydrogene to deprenyl. I mean, I've tried all of them, and I think they all have their pros and cons. But I personally will stick to it. Just a little bit of deprenyl 3 times a week, like 1 milligram. I'll get enough choline each day, and then I'll kind of rotate through some of the racetams, pyracetam or oxyracetam. Or
what's your favorite source of choline?
Alpha GPC is usually what I use. It's a good one, but I've played around with different ones.
And 1 milligram of deprenyl, you find enough 3 times a week?
Yeah, I mean, I think the older you get, from what I've read, the probably the more you need to start taking them.
Folks.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm almost 40. I'll start taking a gram a day every day here. But for now, I've been doing a gram every 3 days a week or so. So that's the nutrition side, or sorry, on the cognitive side. I tend to not overdo a lot of supplements. I mean, I'll take in a protein shake here and there if I'm not getting enough through my food. But the more and more I've looked at stuff, the more you find, like, I don't know if you saw this, but there was a paper that's basically found if you take in a bunch of caffeine before your workout, which is a very common thing to do, it can actually blunt some of the aerobic response. In other words, it can actually blunt some of the effectiveness of the workout. It's simply, if you improve the performance of a workout artificially, you're just minimizing the stress of that workout and kind of taking away the response, which is the improvements you want to see. So I tend to not use a lot of pre-workout supplements. I don't use a lot of those stimulants and that into things. So I don't use a ton. Personally, my family has a really bad history of heart disease, so I use red rice yeast, whatever it is, which quite a bit. And I've measured my LDL levels quite a bit, and that's improved it. So it's funny, the older you get, the more I'm focusing on just staying alive and healthy versus trying to get big and strong. It's just changing perspective as you age, I guess.
For sure, man. And that's kind of the new direction of my life is, after a long time aspiring to be the biggest human being on the planet, now it's like, how can I live longest and inspire the greatest number of people to live their greatest life, man? That's why I reached out to you, man, because I realized that HRV is massive, whether it be for an athlete or just someone looking to optimize health and longevity. So, man, I'm totally grateful for what you're doing, and please continue to lead this area, because there's very few people, at least as far as I can see, who are very well versed and do such a great job of kind of spreading the message of HRV and energy system type training. Because to me, this is the next frontier of how to optimize performance, right? If you're not paying attention to this stuff, you're just not performing well, right? Like, I don't think anyone in the bodybuilding space pays attention to HRV. Not that anyone that I've seen. So again, as I exit that world and head more into just overall longevity and health, this is at the forefront of my focus. So thank you, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important. If